A couple weeks ago, I had an experience with something that's really been bothering me. What's worse, my husband does not believe me, and part of me hopes that it happens again so I can get a video or so he can be with me and I can convince him of what happened. For a little bit of backstory, we live in the middle of a newly incorporated area in the northern Midwest, and there are still a lot of woods near the house. In fact, our backyard is right against the thickest area of trees, so we get a good amount of basic wildlife, like deer and the occasional predator, like coyotes through here. Normally, the best way to handle wildlife in a small city like this is to acknowledge but ignore. Acknowledge that you saw it, but don't pay too much attention. Eventually, they'll go away. It was about 7 in the morning. My husband had left for work about half an hour before, and my dog was going crazy at the back door. I was drag-assing around the house, having not had my coffee yet, and not sleeping well through the night. So I trudged over to the door and let him out into the yard to go do his business. Then I slowly walked back to the chair and threw myself down, nearly falling back asleep. After a few moments, he started barking like crazy. I ignored it for a moment or two, but then when he started panic scratching at the door, I knew something was up. Thinking it was one of the aforementioned coyotes, I made my way over to the back door and opened it. Max, my dog, shoves his way into the house and runs straight down to the basement, something he only does during thunderstorms. After I watch him practically jump down the stairs, I look back into the yard to see what the hell had him so riled up. In the woods, right by where the chain link fence is, I see this strange dog-like creature. At first, I thought it was a fox with some kind of physical defect. It was larger and mangier, or maybe a messed up coyote. I stood there in my pajamas for a solid 2 to 3 minutes, just staring at whatever this thing was. It had dark hair, shining eyes, and overall was just creepy to look at. After those few minutes of us staring at each other, this thing walks over to the fence and leaps up onto its hind legs, grabbing the metal bar at the top of the fence. As soon as that happened, I slammed the door and ran back inside. I legitimately have no idea what the hell that thing was, but it was big and horrifying. I called my husband and told him that some wolf thing was in our backyard, and he literally laughed at me. Of course, when I went to go to try and get a picture of it, it was gone. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I haven't seen it again, and my dog doesn't seem too fazed by it anymore. I've been going out back with him every day since, but nothing's been there. I promise you though, if I ever see this thing again, I'm getting a video and sending it to every major news outlet out there. This story takes place about 10 or so years ago, back when I was around 18 years old, and I was a much more fit and active young man. Back then, I lived in the northern part of Oklahoma, which was where I was born and raised for pretty much the first half of my life. This area was gorgeous. I lived near a certain native reservation, and it was a really lovely place with a lot of wilderness and trails and woods. I didn't live on the reservation, but I lived in an area near it, and I had a lot of friends that did live there, including my then boyfriend, Zach. I was super serious about nature back then. I would honestly hike and bike through the recreation area, and I spent so many days of my younger years in the natural area. I spent so much time there that I would say I had memorized all of the trails and paths throughout. I would spend entire days on the trail sometimes, heading out around 10 or 11 in the morning, and then I wouldn't get home until dinner or when the sun was setting. As I said, my boyfriend lived on the reserve, and he was great about going on the trails with me, but at the same time, he just wasn't as big of a trail nerd as I was. There would be times when I would head over to his place to spend time with him, but would end up biking down on the trails later into the afternoon. He would typically stay home and do whatever he was doing, and because of this, I was usually alone in the woods, just me, my thoughts, and a bunch of trees. While I loved each of the trails and spent a lot of the time going as far into the forest as I could, and went out to find new areas, there was one specific trail that I was very partial to. I don't recall if it had a name, but this trail I personally dubbed the downstream path. I named it as such because it went alongside a stream and it was downhill, which was super creative, right? This trail was my favorite for a handful of reasons. The path was beautiful. There were trees on one side and the stream on the other. You could get a lot of speed as you took the downhill, and it was mostly remote, so there was very little risk of ever crashing into another person or running into other hikers. On the specific day of this event, I was riding the trails alone. It was really early in the day, and I don't recall the exact time, but Zach wasn't awake yet, and there was no other foot traffic on the path. I was riding the trails and was just happily taking in the morning air and enjoying the cool breeze when I came up toward the hill where the downstream path starts. I was really feeling the cool air that day, and there was seriously no one else on the path, so I figured why not just hop on the trail and go crazy with it. I hopped over to the top of the hill and stared down at the lower parts of the forest. There was a thin haze that was rising over the stream and through the trees, and it was absolutely lovely. I geared up for the downhill and took off. I was riding down the hill and picking up speed and was probably going way too fast for my own personal safety. I was taking the bends and curves tightly as I approached them and feeling the energy and adrenaline of the ride when I took one of the curves way too fast and too sharp. And as I was trying to straighten out the wheel and regain my bearings, I hit a bump and ended up ditching the bike and landing in a small section of the woods flat on my back, staring straight up at the morning sky. I was just sitting there and lying on my back, staring up at the dark blue and the tops of the trees. I was trying to catch my breath and sorting through what exactly happened as the moment of fog slowly lifted out of my brain. Landing square on your back after crashing out at a high speed will absolutely make you see stars and make it to where the moment feels like the world is spinning. To be honest, the whole thing was almost comfortable until I started to hear the sounds of the forest after a few moments. Then I started hearing what sounded like heavy steps somewhere around me, steps that had some real weight and heft behind them. While I ignored them for a couple seconds, my thoughts went through what it could be. Then it occurred to me that I was in a forest in Oklahoma, which meant that there was a very real possibility of it being a black bear. I quickly sat up and started to look around me for a bear, but honestly didn't see anything at first. After sitting confused and trying to see what exactly it was, again thinking it was a bear, I saw what was actually making the sounds. And while it wasn't a bear, I kind of wish it was. In the forest line, around 30 or so feet away from me, there was some sort of creature that was standing by the stream. This thing stood to be at least 6 or 7 foot tall. Its entire body was covered in dark brown hair that was a bit matted and coarse. Its mouth was elongated and it had large pulled back ears, and while it wasn't snarling, I could see that it had fairly large teeth. It had the stature of a man to some extent, but it was taller and lankier than any man I had ever seen. If I had to describe it in a few words, I would say this damn thing looked like a stereotypical werewolf. This thing was just standing there and staring at me, kind of like it was trying to size me up and determine if I was worth its time. The entire time, which was probably a few seconds, my heart was racing, and I could feel myself starting to hyperventilate in a panic. I was trying to stay still, and I was trying to remain calm, but this thing could have killed me, and I honestly thought I was about to die. Thankfully, after those few moments, this thing slowly knelt down and slowly stepped away from me and back toward the stream. Each step that he took made my heart skip a beat, and it felt like it pulled the air from my lung. When I was certain that it was far enough away that it was no longer interested in me, I slowly stood up and grabbed my bike and stepped back toward the trail, then hopped on and took off like a bat out of hell. When I got back to Zach's house, he could tell that I was freaking out, and he asked me what was going on. I told him about how I was riding down the trail and how I crashed, and then I told him that I saw that weird creature in the woods. I described it as best I could, pretty much like a werewolf. Then out of nowhere, Zach says, "Oh, like a dogman?" Then he goes on to tell me that there have been sightings of the dogman in the woods on the reservation. Then he goes on to drop the bombshell that I was lucky because apparently this creature could have torn me to shreds, and basically no one would have ever found my body. I live in one of the northern states where temperatures start dropping fast in the fall. Because of this, and since we had a fireplace, we typically had it on instead of the heat. As an adult now, I've learned how much it can really save on heating bills. My parents would usually buy logs in bulk, but we did have a lot of acreage, so just to pad the supply, my dad would also cut down some trees or branches around the property. Of course, being around 14 or 15, I would help my dad collect it and bring it back. I never had a problem with it though. I enjoyed the fall and winter as well as the time I got to spend alone with my dad. We usually just push the wheelbarrow around or a small trailer attached to an ATV to lug them back to the house, depending on the weather. Another normal occurrence when we were out there was the wildlife. We would see birds, rabbits, squirrels, and even deers. We pretty much coexisted with them all. It may come as a surprise to some, but my family was not a bunch of hunters. They didn't like the idea of killing them, in fact. My dad hated the hunting seasons because we could hear the gunshots all over. He didn't even own a gun. They were both weirdo, hippie country folk, but I can appreciate that. Even as an adult, hunting does not interest me. Anyways, so when we're out, sometimes we would name off birds that we saw or other animals, and based on what they were doing or how they looked, we made stories about them. We would even give them a name, a backstory, and even where they were heading. But when we did come across coyotes, foxes, and even one terrifying time a mountain lion, we stayed back and avoid them as much as possible. Besides, we're the ones that are more out of place than them. Sorry for rambling, just wanted to share a bit of backstory of my family and to possibly explain why we reacted the way we did to the following event. So one fall day, I had helped my dad cut down a tree that was in the way of some fencing he was putting up. We had to stop to go get a part for the wheelbarrow because one of the legs had broken or something in the middle of me bringing it over. As one simple task normally does, it ended up taking us all day to finish it. I don't remember exactly what all happened, but it was probably the normal multiple trips and errands to run, and then by the time we got home and fixed the damn thing, my mom had dinner started and said I needed to do my homework before anything else. So we decided to wait until after I finished and we had dinner before we went back out there. I think we were both feeling pretty worn out, and since it was getting late, my dad suggested we just take the ATV instead to make the trip easier. So we got back to the tree and started loading up the trailer with the smaller stuff. While doing so, I started feeling like I was being watched. As mentioned, it was normal to see animals and have some of them just stare, but this feeling was putting me on edge. I started looking around everywhere when I spotted something between the trees on the other side of the house. At first, it had the shape of a dog, so I thought it was either a stray or maybe a coyote. But the more I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. My dad must have noticed me stop, and he asked what I was looking at, so I pointed it out to him. He stopped as well and stared at the thing. I remember asking him what he thought it was, and after hesitating for several moments, he finally said, "It looks like a rough-looking dog." I could tell in his voice, though, that he didn't like this either. Usually when we ran into potentially dangerous animals, my dad was calm and just suggested we move on. However, he would not look away from this thing. I asked him if he was feeling creeped out too, and surprisingly, he said yeah. So I started telling him how I was feeling too. That's when he told me that something just wasn't right about the creature. We just stood there, completely still, and watched this thing until it finally moved. It started walking along the trees, but the way it was walking was even more unnatural. It had 4 legs, but it wasn't bending them at the knees. The movement was very stiff. Imagine how a doll would walk without the knee joints, or when you walk your fingers like legs. Sorry if this doesn't make sense, but it's kind of hard to explain. So when I saw it walking, I became even more alarmed. I mentioned it to my dad, but he just continued watching it. The thing started walking towards us, which meant the trees were thinning out, shedding more light on it. That's when we could see more details. This thing was definitely bigger than a coyote, but it looked disheveled. Its fur was dirty and almost patchy looking. While it seemed to look dark and have an even darker aura around it, it had bright, glowing orange-looking eyes. As it got closer, we also started smelling something like rotting. Again, we saw a lot of wildlife, some alive and some dead, so I knew the smell. We didn't smell it until we noticed this creature. As it walked closer, we could make out a moaning sound that also didn't sound natural. It didn't sound like a person, but it also didn't sound like an animal in pain. This was when the feeling of dread really started to overwhelm me. But before I could mention it to my dad, without taking his sight off this thing, he told me to run towards the house as fast as I could. When I heard him shout "run," I took off only to look back once to see my dad right behind me. He nearly shoved me in the house as he ran in behind me, closing and locking the door. My mom and 2 little siblings were all watching a movie in the living room, so she was instantly startled and asked us what happened. My dad let out a little laugh, saying we saw a coyote that was looking pretty aggressive, so we decided to run home. She seemed a bit suspicious, but accepted his response and we went to clean up. I wasn't about to call my dad out. I assume he did it since my siblings were there and probably didn't want to scare my mom. He probably would have done the same to me if I hadn't witnessed it. We didn't talk about it again that night, and we went and finished gathering the wood the next day when it was nice and bright out. I asked him about it then, if he really thought it was a coyote, and he honestly told me no. He said he didn't know what it was, but he knew it wasn't a normal animal and that it wasn't friendly. I asked him what he thought it was, and he didn't answer me for a while. Then he finally spoke up, and the only thing he said was, "It's something we should never think about or talk about again." My dad was not easily frightened, but the tone in this response was enough to make me think he was serious, so I never brought it up again. Now that I'm older and after seeing many stories of cryptids and talking to friends that believe in that kind of stuff, I'm pretty sure it was a skinwalker. Regardless, it was a terrifying sight, and those out there trying to find one to witness themselves, I would suggest stopping now. It's really not worth it. I have a story from when I was young that is 100% true, but I honestly have no way to prove it, and I'm guessing a lot of people won't believe it. I just want to tell someone the story that will believe it, or at least enjoy it, so here goes. When I was around 12, my best buddy Jordan and I used to spend a lot of time out of the house. Like, a lot of time. We would go to school, and the minute we got off the bus, we would go in, drop off our book bags, and then would be out in the woods until almost 9 or when our parents yelled for us. We would typically skip dinner because we were both young nature enthusiasts and genuinely loved spending time out on the trails. Thankfully, Jordan had an excellent sense of direction and could almost always get us home without issue. Me, on the other hand, I was so bad at figuring out where we were that I could walk 20 feet to the north of where the forest started and be lost. I liked bugs and trees though, so I was always all for it. Now, all of that explains what I loved about being in the woods with Jordan and how we always had a good time. However, there was a stretch where things weren't quite so fun or comfortable. This happened back in the 80s. I don't remember when exactly, but like I said, I was around 12 or 13. I remember it was in October because all the trees were bright red-orange, and it was my favorite time of the year. If you've never seen a Midwestern fall in the middle of the woods, I highly recommend it. The trees were all covered in oranges, reds, and yellows, and the ground plants were starting to die off. So it was a major contrast between the dead tan and the colorful trees. The first time I knew something was off was on one of the random trips that we took out into the woods. We were playing, and it was starting to get dark pretty early by then. I think we were pretending to be soldiers or something, which is what we typically did, and were stealthily treading through enemy territory. We were hiding behind trees and splitting up to take down the base when I remember hearing something in one of the trees. At first I thought it was a squirrel, and I looked up to see if I could find it, but I didn't see what it was. I ignored it and moved on with what we were playing. After a few more minutes of us doing this, I remember I heard a branch above snapping and thinking, dang, that must be a fat squirrel. But when I looked again, the thing I saw was not a squirrel. I couldn't tell what it was at first, and I remember laughing because I looked over at Jordan and said, "Hey, is that a monkey?" Which was a dumb question because I live in the Midwest and we very clearly do not have monkeys. We both kind of stood there and stared at it, but couldn't figure out what it was because it wasn't really moving, just standing in the tree looking away from us and swaying back and forth. And by swaying, I think the best way to describe it is like a praying mantis. If you've ever seen a praying mantis that feels threatened, they kind of sway back and forth. It was like that. We just watched it for several moments and then tried to kind of walk around the tree to see the front of this thing. But as soon as it noticed us, it ran up the tree and hid to the point that we couldn't find it again. We made plans to come back up the next day and try to see if we could figure out what this thing was, because I was stumped. I was pretty well versed in most of the fauna in our area, because that's what I was into at the time. But this thing was weird. The only thing I could seriously think it looked like was a monkey of some kind. I asked my parents that night if there were any monkeys or apes around us, just to be absolutely certain, and they confirmed there wasn't, aside from the zoo. Obviously, no one had heard anything about an escaped animal from the zoo on the news, so I was back to being stumped. The next day, Jordan and I brought our binoculars to see if we could get a better view, trying to spot this thing. We didn't do much beyond just sitting on a log and watching the trees, seeing if this thing would come back, and it did, but it seemed like it was trying to avoid the area that we were waiting in. So it was like it was aware of us more than something like a squirrel or a rodent or whatever. It wasn't until the 4th day of us staking out the woods that we actually got to see this thing clearly. It was a Saturday, So we had the entire day to stake out the area and see if we could find it. And much to our surprise, when we got into the woods in the morning, we did see it, except it wasn't in the trees. We walked into the wooded area, and no more than 100 feet or so, this thing was on the ground. It looked like it was eating something like a hedge apple because it was smashing it into the ground and peeling it apart. We went into full stealth mode and crouched behind some of the brush and crept really slowly over to the side so we could see this thing. This is where everything went from, "This is fun, what is this thing?" straight to, "I wish we would have never seen this thing." Whatever this thing was, it was definitely ape-like in structure, but its face looked way too human. If you've ever seen a shaved ape, they have faces similar to humans, but they're discernible. This thing was not. It had a human's face, it was structured like a person, there was nothing there that resembled an animal at all. The mouth was flattened down more like a person's, the nose protruded at an angle like a human's, and the eyes were inset like a human's. We watched this thing eat the hedge apple and then slowly creep up the tree and climb out of sight. After that, I told Jordan that I wanted to go home, and he agreed. Something about seeing this thing, it triggered some kind of deeply inset fear that neither of us had ever experienced. It was like our brains knew that that thing wasn't natural at all, and it wanted us to block it out and never think about it again. We actually took a few weeks off from going into the woods, mostly because we didn't want to see this thing again. We did eventually get the courage to go back, but thankfully we never did see it. I have no idea what it was, but it was definitely not your standard animal from around my part of the world. And the fact that it switched on some kind of primal fear, it was just terrifying. I'm glad we never saw it again, and I'm glad I was able to get this out, because thinking about it sends shivers down my spine and makes me almost feel that same level of terror, even this many years down the road. Hello, friends. So that was 4 cryptid stories. I do not envy those people, mostly because I'm a scaredy cat. But I appreciate them sharing their experience for the rest of us to enjoy. And if you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like or a comment below and tell me what you thought. And if you'd like to see more content like this, consider subscribing. That being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic day or a fantastic night wherever you are, and I'll see you on the next video. Until next time, take care.